Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this important and timely webinar on Jamaica's constitutional reform process. My name is Nastasia McFarlane, and I am the Director of Corporate Communication and Public Relations here at the Ministry, and I'm honored to be your host for today's session. Now, first and foremost, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of our participants joining us from across Jamaica and beyond. Your presence here today underscores the significance of this topic and your commitment to being informed and engaged citizens of our journey to becoming a republic. As we all know, constitutional reform is a pivotal issue that touches the very foundation of our governance, our rights, and most importantly, our national identity as Jamaicans. The discussions we have today will play a crucial role in shaping the future of our Jamaica, or Jamaica that we can call our very own, ensuring that our constitutional framework reflects the values and aspirations of all Jamaicans. We are privileged to have an expert panel with us here, including Mrs. Janelle Miller-Williams, Senior Director of the Legal Education Division here in the Ministry. We also have Mr. Ivan Godfrey, who is the Legal Education Officer in the Legal Education Division. And we have a Constitutional Reform Committee member, Dr. Nadeen Spence, here to give her insights on the deliberations of the Constitutional Reform Committee. Now, they bring a wealth of knowledge and experience and insights and wonderful perspectives that will help us navigate the complexities of the topic that we know as constitutional reform. Now, before we dive into our discussions here this evening, I would like to highlight the agenda for today's webinar. Now, we will be hearing from the ministry's permanent secretary first, and he will bring us warm regards to begin the session so that we have a better understanding of what it is that we will speak about. Following that, we will have a presentation by our expert panelists, as I mentioned before, and they would give a simpler, more meaningful understanding to the report of the Constitutional Reform Committee on the transition to the Republic of Jamaica and other matters. Now, we are encouraging all of our participants to use the chat so you can ask your questions. We want a spirited conversation and we want to engage in discussions with you throughout the webinar. So please, if you hear something that you are maybe so sure about or you have questions of your own, please ensure that you use the chat. Now, while we embark on this journey to the road to Republic, we want this to be a very contributing discussion so that everyone can understand a little bit better Jamaica's constitutional reform process. Now, without further ado, I welcome the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs, Mr. Wayne O. Robertson.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, Ms. Nastasia McFarlane, Director of Corporate Communications and Public Relations. Let me also recognize Dr. Nadeen Spence, member of the Constitutional Reform Committee and Chairman of the very important Public Engagement and Communication Subcommittee of the Constitutional Reform Committee. Mrs. Janelle Miller-Williams, Senior Director, Legal Education. Ms. Julia Wedderburn, our Senior Legal Education Officer. Mr. Ivan Godfrey and Ms. Yannick Douglas, Legal Education Officers. And I wish to also recognize Mr. Hansel Ramdon, our Director of ICT, and Mr. Christopher Thomas, Infrastructure Manager. Ladies and gentlemen who have taken time out of their very busy schedule to join this webinar, I greet you all very well. It was a Chinese philosopher, Lao Tzu, who said that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Several steps have already been taken along the road to Republic, starting with, and I'll just name a few. One, the establishment of a constitutional reform division in the 1970s in the Ministry of Justice. Two, the establishment of a joint select committee on constitutional and electoral reform, and subsequently the Constitutional Reform Commission in 1991. Thirdly, the submission of the final report of the commission in 1994, of course, and also the submission thereafter of a report by the Joint Select Committee to Parliament in 1995, which was subsequently accepted. And fifthly and finally, amendments to the Constitution to provide for the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms in 2011. Ladies and gentlemen, those are just some of the attempts made in the past to reform our constitution. Despite these efforts, Jamaica's head of state is still based in England, and significant proposals for reform remain outstanding today. The destination has oftentimes appeared unreachable because of the myriad obstacles along the way. There have been many starts and stops. But with the establishment of the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs in January 2022, greater focus has been given to the constitutional reform agenda, resulting in the establishment of the Constitutional Reform Committee in March 2023 and the subsequent tabling of the committee's recommendations as a ministry paper on May 21st of this year. Ladies and gentlemen, today represents a major step as we journey on the road to republic. We need to hear from you. Do you agree with the recommendations of the Constitutional Reform Committee? If not, what new recommendations do you wish to proffer? We want to hear from you. It is our intention to carry the entire population with us along this journey, culminating in a constitution which reflects the will of the people of Jamaica. I look forward to the engagement that will ensue, and I look forward to your recommendations that certainly will be shared ultimately with the Constitutional Reform Committee. Let me again, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join this very important webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Permanent Secretary Mr. Wayne O. Robertson. Now we are going to get right into the meat of the matter. We'll be hearing from Mrs. Janelle Miller-Williams, the Senior Director of the Legal Education Division in the ministry, followed by Mr. Ivan Godfrey, who is the Legal Education Officer. And don't forget, we do have a Constitutional Reform Committee member here, Dr. Nadeen Spence. So if you see anything throughout the presentations and you want to ask your questions, if you have anything to ask directly to Dr. Nadeen Spence, please type it in the chat so that she can answer your question as effectively as she can. Mrs. Miller-Williams, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ms. McFarlane, and also to our Permanent Secretary. Good evening to all the participants here, and a special thank you to those who have taken the time to log in and join us for our discussions this afternoon. We hope to have very fruitful discussions this evening. As the Permanent Secretary had indicated, I am Janelle Miller-Williams, and with me from my team is Mr. Ivan Godfrey, and we will walk you through the PowerPoint presentation, and Dr. Nadeen Spence, the CRC member, Constitutional Reform Committee member, is here to answer any questions that you have. So without further ado, I will walk you through our presentation. So the content of our presentation, we will first give a brief introduction in terms of what is a constitution, what is constitutional monarchy, a republic. We'll go through the role of the Constitutional Reform Committee. Then we will go into the recommendations of the Constitutional Reform Committee report. We will go a little bit more detailed into the constitutional reform, and then we will have a question and answer segment. So you can make note of all the questions that you have, and we will take them at the end of the session. So first of all, what is a constitution? So the constitution is the supreme law of Jamaica, which means that, in essence, all laws have to conform with the constitution. If not, they are deemed unconstitutional, null and void. So the Constitution establishes a framework for governance, and it outlines the rights, responsibilities of the government as well as the state. Also, the fundamental rights and freedoms of the people that are in the Chapter 3 of the Constitution. So, for example, some of the critical provisions in the Constitution include, for example, the establishment of the Supreme Court, the establishment of the Court of Appeal, establishment of the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution, as well as the establishment of the appointment of the Attorney General. in respect of fundamental rights and freedom of the people. For example, there's a right to life, right? There's also the freedom of expression and freedom of movement. So these are some critical fundamental rights that are included in the Constitution. So Jamaica's current system of governance is a constitutional monarchy. What is a constitutional monarchy? So a constitutional monarchy is a form of government in which the country has a monarch as the ceremonial and symbolic head of state, right? But the powers are limited by a constitution. So the monarch, simply put, a monarch is either a king or a queen. And a monarch also is, the role is hereditary, which means that you become the monarch based on your position in line. So, for example, as you may be aware, Queen Elizabeth II, she was the queen for approximately over 70 years. 70 years, right? She had 4 children, and her eldest child was at the time Prince Charles. So automatically he was next in line to become the king. So Queen Elizabeth II died in 2022, and automatically her eldest child, which was Prince Charles at the time, now has become king. And going on next in line after King Charles is Prince William. So that is what we mean by hereditary monarch. So currently, Jamaica's monarch is King Charles III, and his operational and ceremonial duties are exercised by his representative, the Governor General of Jamaica, Sir Patrick Allen. So Jamaica's intended system of governance is being a republic. What is a republic? So a republic is a form of government in which the power is held by the people. But instead of ruling directly, the people elect representatives to represent them and their interests. So you will have a head of state or president. So the terms head of state and president can be used interchangeably. So the head of state slash president is not a monarch. So let us look closely now at the Constitutional Reform Committee. The Constitutional Reform Committee was convened by the Government of Jamaica to assist in providing expert guidance and oversight to the government and also the people of Jamaica during this constitutional reform process, which means that we want to make changes to the Constitution. So this committee has been put in place to provide that expert guidance. You see a photo there with a few members of the Constitutional Reform Committee, minus the permanent secretary and also Mr. Christopher Harper, which is the liaison person. So in the committee, we have members from the civil society. We have a youth advisor. We have members from the church, as well as the government, members of the government and members of the opposition. We have the attorney general. We also have constitutional lawyers, right, who have provided that expert guidance on the Constitution. So in May 2024, the Constitutional Reform Committee, also known as the CRC, after deliberations, they have submitted a report. So they submitted its report to Cabinet. And this report is entitled The Report of the Constitutional Reform Committee on the Transition to the Republic of Jamaica and Other Matters. So you may have heard the term Jamaicanizing the Constitution. So what exactly does this mean? So our Constitution of 1962, it was passed in the UK. And it was passed in the UK by something called an Order in Council, right? Signed by Queen Elizabeth II. But to Jamaicanize the Constitution now, it means that we want to have our Constitution, which is, remember, the highest law of Jamaica. It's the supreme law of the land. We want the Constitution to be approved by the Parliament and the people of Jamaica so that it will reflect our Jamaican culture and our heritage. At this time now, I will walk you through some of the recommendations that have been tabled in cabinet, that have been submitted to cabinet. First, the CRC recommended that the monarchy be abolished. So they recommended the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of the republic. So they want to remove the monarchy and create the Republic of Jamaica by replacing the King of England with a president. Secondly, the insertion of a preamble. What is a preamble? Simply put, a preamble is a useful introduction, right? So a useful introduction to the Constitution. And this will pretty much capture Jamaica's history and aspirations. So the CRC suggested putting together a committee of specialists, a committee comprising a poet, laureate, a university lecturer, a Jamaican author, and a Jamaican musician, right? So that they can come up with a preamble. Afterwards, the CRC will then examine and modify the suggested preambles before recommending the most suitable one for the upcoming constitution. Next, another recommendation is the insertion of national emblems and symbols. So the new constitution would now include, a recommendation is that the constitution would include the following symbols of Jamaica's identity, history, people, goals, and values. So the recommendation is to include the national emblems, such as the national flag, the national anthem, and the coat of arms. But please note that the coat of arms will be reviewed to see if it needs any changes. They want to also include the national symbols, such as the national tree, the national flower, the national fruit, which is the aki, the national bird, the hummingbird. Also, the national motto, the national pledge, the national song, and the national prayer. Right? So it is recommended that the Constitution should vest intellectual property of the national emblems in the state, right? And that the Parliament should be empowered to make laws to regulate against their misuse. So in essence, what this really means is that we want to put in place legal protection then of these national emblems so that there's no misuse. We want to include the Jamaican Interpretation Act of 1968, right? So it is suggested that we replace the UK Interpretation Act of 1889 with the Jamaican Interpretation Act of 1968. So the new constitution will reflect Jamaica's current and future reality. And it is therefore very important that a Jamaican law be used to interpret Jamaica's constitution, right? And an Interpretation Act sets out the rules and definitions for writing, interpreting, and applying the laws of a country. Another recommendation is the words of enactment. So words of enactment are words in a bill. So when we say bill, bill is not yet law, but it's a proposal of a law, right? So it's proposed law. So the words of enactment are words in a bill that indicate the source of authority to make it an approved law, right? So it is suggested that the new words of enactment empower Parliament to pass and now enact laws in its name, right? So if a law needs the people's approval, for example, in a referendum, it will say that it is enacted by the Parliament and people of Jamaica. Otherwise, it would say the Parliament of Jamaica, right? So on May 28th, 2024, a bill giving effect to this recommendation was passed in the House of Representatives. This slide shows you the example of what currently exists and what is the proposed change. So you have be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate and House of Representatives, and it goes on. But the proposed change says be it enacted by the Parliament of Jamaica, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate and the House of Representatives of Jamaica. So that is the proposed change by the CRC. So I had indicated earlier that I had indicated earlier that the recommendation was to replace the British monarchy with a republic, right? So this slide goes a little bit further, right? So the recommendation is that Jamaica should no longer have the British monarch as its head of state, but instead the head of state should be chosen through a democratic process, right? And it will now reflect Jamaica's sovereignty. This change involves one, removing King Charles III as the head of state, and secondly, removing King Charles III from our parliament. This means that a new head of state for the Republic of Jamaica would be established. The recommendation of the CRC is that the Jamaican president will be a non-executive president. Another recommendation is what is the creation of the office of president. Okay, so the president should be a head of state who holds, as I had indicated before, a non-executive president. So this non-executive president will be the head of state, but who holds a ceremonial or symbolic role, similar to the governor general. President should have, however, some executive functions, right? But not be involved in the running of government. So some examples of executive powers will include to declare a period of public emergency, to appoint persons to high office, such as ministers, senators, chief justice, to dissolve parliament following a vote of no confidence in the government, and also to grant pardon in capital cases, right? Cases where the death penalty may be sought. So another recommendation is the method of appointment of the president. So the recommendation is choosing the president will involve two steps. The first step is that the Prime Minister will nominate a candidate after reaching an agreement with the leader of the opposition. The second step is that the Parliament will confirm the nominee in a joint session. So there will be a joint session with both the House of Representatives and the Senate, but the voting will take separately. And while the voting take place, there must be at least a 2/3 majority vote in each house, right? So the House of Representatives, otherwise known as lower house, and the Senate is otherwise known as upper house. So there ought to be at least a 2/3 majority vote in each house, and then Parliament will confirm the nominee. Another recommendation is what are the required qualifications. So to become a president, a person must, one, be a Jamaican citizen by birth or by descent up to grandparent, which means that that person must have a grandparent who is a Jamaican citizen. Secondly, that person must live in Jamaica regularly and permanently for at least 10 years out of the last 15 years before nomination. So, for example, if someone is nominated to become president in 2025, for example, at least 15 years before 2025, they ought to be living in Jamaica on a regular and permanent basis, right? So remember that they have to be living in Jamaica for at least 10 years out of the 15 years before nomination, right? Thirdly, they ought not to owe any allegiance to a foreign country because of their own actions, and they must not be disqualified from being elected to parliament. So these are the recommendations for the required qualifications to become a president. The functions and powers. So with respect to the Governor General and his responsibilities, the Governor General's constitutional, statutory, and customary responsibilities will now be assumed by the President of the Republic of Jamaica. Under the new constitution, the Jamaica Privy Council will be referred to as the President's Council, with all of its powers and functions remaining unchanged. Privy Council is just a formal body of advisors to the Governor General under the Constitution. Tenure of office. So it is recommended that the president's term is for 7 years, and they can be reappointed for a second term of up to 5 years. The process to choose a new president should start at least 1 year before the current president's term ends. And this is just to ensure that there's a smooth transition and handover of office. Immunity. The president is protected from being sued or prosecuted for, one, doing their job as president or any related actions. Also, any activity not involving treason, fraud, or violence while in office. So the president will have that protection, right, known as immunity. Resignation. Another recommendation from the CRC is to resign from office. The president must send a letter to the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the President of the Senate, together with copies to the Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition. Temporary vacancy. If the president is unexpectedly absent or temporarily unable to fulfill duties, for example, due to illness or any other reason, then the Prime Minister, after consulting with the Leader of Opposition, should appoint an acting president from among the custodies. Termination of appointment. It is recommended that the president's appointment can be terminated if, one, they're unable to perform their duties due to mental or physical incapacity or any other reason. So if they're mentally incapable or physically incapable of performing their duties, then that is one reason that they can be terminated. Also, if they act in a way that threatens national security. Also, if they behave in a manner that brings shame to the office, or if they pledge allegiance to a foreign country. And allegiance is pretty much showing any form of loyalty or commitment to another country. So the process of termination. A motion is like a proposal for an action. So if a motion to remove the president, a motion must be there to remove the president. It must be presented to the parliament, right, in a joint session of both houses. Remember, you have the House of Representatives, which is also known as lower house, and the Senate, which is also known as the upper house. So there ought to be a joint session of both houses, right? And a motion to remove the president must be presented to Parliament in a joint session of both houses. And this motion will now require a 2/3 vote in each house, right? So after Parliament approves the motion, a special parliamentary committee will be formed. So a committee then therefore will be formed. And if it is determined that there are grounds for removing the president, now a resolution will be passed by a 2/3 majority vote in both houses of parliament, right? And this will be conducted by a secret ballot in each house. If Parliament agrees to remove the president, the office of the president will become vacant and a new president is selected. Now, the transition to the office of the President of the Republic of Jamaica. When the new constitution takes effect, the current Governor General will become the transitional President of the Republic of Jamaica until a new president is chosen. So this should happen within 3 months. So at this time, I will now hand over to Mr. Ivan Godfrey, who will walk us through the reformation of Parliament. Ivan Godfrey, I hand over to you.
Before we hand over to Mr. Godfrey, Mrs. Miller-Williams, we want to say thank you for your part of the presentation. And I see that the questions are coming in really, really, really well. So I will just ask Dr. Nadeen Spence, because I saw a question here for you, Dr. Spence, earlier. Let me just go up and so I can see. It was from a Mr. Ligor Smith, if my memory serves me correctly. So, Dr. Spence, I saw that you had made mention of it in the comment section. This is now your opportunity to respond to Mr. Smith.
So, good evening, everyone. Let me put on my earphone. I do notice that there are a number of comments, Mr. Smith, In particular, you are talking about two things, and those things are not particularly new in respect of conversations about something called sovereignty and the Caribbean people. And this is not confined to Jamaica either. One, about whether or not our independence in 1962 was true independence, or whether or not any subsequent attempt at building upon that independence process will be true. And that's not necessarily a new discussion. One of the things I mentioned, but my messages unfortunately are not going to you yet. We'll fix that soon. One of the things that I did mention is that when as a student at the university, one of the first essays I read was an essay called The Myth of Independence. And perhaps you can find that essay written by Louis Lindsay and read that so that you can, build your arguments around whether or not Jamaica had gained or will ever gain true independence. So that's a matter that has been discussed time and time again. You also talk about Jamaica, the corporation. I don't necessarily agree that a country should be referred to as a corporation. And you raise issues as well about land ownership. And those are relevant issues that I think should be addressed. And I'm not sure if they will be addressed in this phase of the reform work, but certainly issues about land ownership and Jamaicans' right to land is a matter that has been on the political agenda in Jamaica for a number of years. And I'm sure you would have heard about something called the LAMP program, for example, where communities are visited, and they started in the previous administration, are visited by different land agencies in Jamaica with the intent on making sure that people have land titles. So I think that's one of the issues that government is addressing across both administrations. I don't know if they're doing so fast enough, and perhaps that's what your discontent is. But the issues that you raised are issues that have been discussed, and I suppose will continue to be discussed, and is part of the narrative of countries like ours that have emerged out of contested independence processes. That doesn't mean that the state isn't legitimate, however. But thanks for your question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spence. Now, I'm also seeing in the chat here, we have a question from Raymond Francis. Now, Dr. Spence, Raymond Francis is asking, why is it that we're proposing to have a non-executive Jamaican president?
Mr. Francis, in our deliberations, we thought about the models of democracy which exist across the world, and what model of democracy offers to people the best representation. One, the most stable democracy, the most solid democracy. What is it that we have seen globally that lends to the people within the country the kind of development that is peaceful, that is equitable for the most part, not necessarily which has fixed all the problems in the society, but which offers the best kind of democratic practice. And what we came up with was that the non-executive presidency in a parliamentary system offers the most stable democracy and is the democratic institution within which issues of equity and equality are best addressed. Now, we can argue over that because there are some people, so for example, if you look at Latin America and look at the models of democracies that emerged in Latin America, when we were deliberating, we looked at Latin America and looked at how contentious their democracies have been through the direct presidential election process. So we looked through, studied models from across the world, and we stuck with the idea of a non-executive president because we thought, given our political culture, given our history, given where we are in terms of our economic development, a non-executive president presents the best chance for the kind of democratic processes and practice that would give our people the best chance at achieving their goals.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spence. And now another question before we jump right back into the presentation. I realized that Mrs. Nicola Borley, she asked a question, who are the custodies? Now, Mrs. Janelle Miller-Williams, I'm posing that question to you.
Okay, thank you for that question. Okay, so custodians are Jamaican citizens who are appointed by the Governor General, and they pretty much assist with the maintenance of good order and discipline in the parish that they have been appointed to. So that's a good definition of custodies.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Miller-Williams. Now we're going to continue with the presentation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned before, please keep your questions coming. We will have a section for the Q&A, but for now, we see your questions and we want to acknowledge them just so that we don't get them lost while we're presenting. But now we're going to hand over to Mr. Ivan Godfrey. He is the Legal Education Officer in the Legal Education Division in the ministry. Mr. Godfrey, your time.
Thank you so much, Ms. McFarlane. Good evening, Jamaica. So I'll be going through with you the reformation of Parliament, Commonwealth citizenship, protection of public institutions, the final Court of Appeal, and then I'll briefly touch on constitutional reform. Now, the Constitutional Reform Committee, in its report, which was tabled in Cabinet, has made several recommendations for the reformation of Parliament. Now, firstly, one such recommendation is the retention of the parliamentary cabinet system. So what would happen is that Jamaica, though becoming a republic, would become a parliamentary republic. So would still maintain a head of government, which would be the prime minister, a head of state, the president, and will still continue to exercise governance in much the same way. In relation to all that Dr. Spence said, I'll add some more to the end because I see several other questions asking along that line of argument. Now, secondly, another recommendation from the CRC pertains to the citizenship qualification for our members of parliament and our senators. No, not many people know this, but currently, a Commonwealth citizen living in Jamaica for the past 12 months, being described as ordinarily resident, is eligible to be elected as a member of parliament or eligible to be selected as a member of the Senate. What the committee has recommended to the government is that in order for a person to be a member of parliament, either elected to the House of Representatives or appointed to the Senate, that person should be a Jamaican citizen. Thirdly, they looked on disqualification from parliament, and their recommendation is that persons or people convicted of treason or any other crime involving fraud or violence, where the sentence is 18 months or longer, should be disqualified from sitting in parliament. Now, a big ticket item that persons have been waiting to hear about is the question of an impeachment process. Now, the recommendation from the Constitutional Reform Committee is that the new constitution should not have an impeachment process. And the reason for this, or the reasons for this are, firstly, an impeachment process mixes legal matters with politics, as most impeachable offenses are criminal and should be tried in courts. Secondly, it can be used for political gain and may lack impartiality in a divided parliament. Thirdly, parliament would need its own investigative resources, which it doesn't presently have. Fourthly, if the matter involves a crime, normal criminal proceedings should be followed and should flow from the commission of that crime. And so there should be an avoidance of overlapping between the courts and parliament. Fifthly, definitions of impeachable offenses are often vague and conflict with principles of natural justice. For example, in the United States, where the terminology high crimes and misdemeanors are used, and this leads to often a lot of conflict in terms of what that exactly means. Now, as it relates to fixed date elections, the CRC's position in relation to this is that unless the two main parties can reach an agreement, then the new constitution should not have fixed dates for general elections. However, if there is an agreement between both parties, the recommendation is that Parliament should have a 5-year fixed term, and within 3 months of the conclusion of that term, the Prime Minister can announce the election date. It also looked on the extension of the life of Parliament. Now, currently, under our present constitution, the life of Parliament can only be extended when Jamaica is at war, something many of us have not seen in our lifetime and hope never to see. Now, the suggestion from the CRC is that this definition or this possibility of extension be extended to include circumstances such as periods of disaster, like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, fire, outbreak of pestilence, infectious diseases, or other calamities. Now, the suggestion from the CRC is very much in line with what obtains now as it relates to circumstances where Jamaica is engaged in war. And this suggestion is that the period of extension be limited to periods not exceeding 6 months in each instance. So in the first instance, there would be a period of 6 months, and then there would be the possibility of extended for further periods of up to 6 months, with a maximum extension being in total 2 years. Now, a big change that the Constitutional Reform Committee has recommended is a change in the composition of the Senate. Now, presently, the Jamaican Senate consists of 21 members, 13 which are appointed by the Governor General on the advice of the Prime Minister, let me be correct, and 8 which are appointed by the Governor General on the advice of the Leader of the Opposition. Now, the change that they've recommended, or the changes that they've recommended, are that firstly, 15 members be recommended by the Prime Minister. So that's up from 13. 9 members be recommended by the Leader of the Opposition, up from 8. And then something completely new now. 3 members chosen by the President from outstanding individuals in private sector, civil society, faith-based or community-based organizations, or any other sector, as needed or necessary. No, so we've given a little pictorial representation of what that increase would look like. So here you see the 15 government senators. I'm not very good with colors. I don't know if you'd call this red or pink. Thereafter, we see our 9 opposition senators with yellow, and then the 3 independent senators, the 3 independent senators appointed by the Governor General, by the new president, in black. And I like that they're all holding hands, that is indicative of something. Now, on the question of citizenship, and particularly Commonwealth citizenship, now it is the view of the Constitutional Reform Committee, as exposed in the report, that any matter dealing with Commonwealth citizenship should be dealt with in ordinary legislation. That means ordinary laws passed by Parliament and not necessarily by or in the Constitution. Concomitantly, Parliament should also be empowered to confer privileges on or make special provisions for CARICOM through, once again, ordinary legislation. No, protection of our public institutions. The first such institution that we'll be looking on is the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. Now, the recommendation of the CRC is that the Electoral Commission of Jamaica should be included in the new constitution and should be given the same level of protection as the Supreme Court of Judicature and the Court of Appeal. However, as we're aware, recent, the Office of the Political Ombudsman was subsumed into the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. The recommendation of the Constitutional Reform Committee is that the Office of the Political Ombudsman should not be given the same treatment as the overarching Electoral Commission of Jamaica. And so the treatment of that office should be left to ordinary legislation. Another very important and key body, the Office of the Public Defender. Now, the CRC recognizes that it was the intention of the Parliament at the time that the legislation creating the Office of the Public Defender was passed, that there was an intention to entrench and I'll explain that later, entrench the Office of the Public Defender in the Constitution. And so this recommendation is that that undertaking be honored. Now, the Office of the Public Defender should be given the same level of protection as proposed for the Electoral Commission of Jamaica, which, as we stated earlier, would be the same level of protection that is now given to the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal. Now, the buzzword or the buzz phrase on everyone's mind, the final Court of Appeal. Who could it be now? No. So, go back to the last slide for me, please. So the question then becomes, do we ascribe to the appellate jurisdiction of the Caribbean Court of Justice, or do we remain with the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, or do we do something else? Now, as it relates to the Caribbean Court of Justice, the Privy Council, or Jamaica having its own final appellate court, the Constitutional Reform Committee recognized that there are conflicting positions in the country on the issue of the final appellate court. And so it made no recommendation in that regard, but considered whether the leaders, of both ends of the political spectrum would assist in building consensus on this issue. And if there is no consensus, there should be a consideration as to whether this should be put before the people for a direct vote. Now, I'll touch briefly, as I said, on constitutional reform. Now, constitutional reform is the process of making changes or amendments to a constitution. Now, it's not something that you can do fly by night. The constitution itself indicates to you how you can make changes to it. So many provisions in our constitution are either what we describe as ordinarily entrenched or deeply entrenched. And what these two fancy terms mean is that they require more than just a simple majority vote in Parliament for an amendment. So a regular piece of legislation, all it requires is half plus one vote in Parliament. However, for amendments to be made to the Constitution, there's going to be a requirement or a higher requirement than those. And what this does is that it ensures that our Constitution, our most important document, our done of all dones, is not easily repealed. And what this does is that it provides stability, durability, and protection, not only of the Constitution, but for us as a people. Now, as I indicated, we have some terms or some provisions in the Constitution which are ordinarily entrenched and some which are deeply entrenched. Now, to alter or change or amend or remove an ordinarily entrenched provision, the bill or proposed law, a law that has been proposed before Parliament is called a bill, it must be approved by 2/3 majority in both houses of Parliament. So there must be a 2/3 majority in the House of Representatives and a 2/3 majority in the Senate. Now, conversely, if we're trying to alter, change, amend a deeply entrenched provision in our Constitution, then the proposed law or bill must be approved by 2/3 majority of both houses of Parliament, and then it must be submitted to the electorate for their direct vote in the form of a referendum. Now, once again, we have a pictorial representation, of what that would look like. Repetition is the student's friend. So we have here our 63 members of Parliament, and 2/3 of 63 is 42. So the X on the 42 heads there are indicative of nothing else except 2/3 majority. So 2/3 majority of the House of Representatives would be 42 out of the 63. Now, as it relates to the Senate, as it is currently constituted, 2/3 majority of that body would be 14 of the 21. Now, for a deeply entrenched provision of our Constitution, which our system of government is, in addition to having 2/3 majority of both houses of parliament, it must go to the electorate in a direct vote. So I'm now going to look on what a referendum is. So a referendum is a direct vote by the electorate. So the question then becomes, who forms the electorate, or what is the electorate? So the electorate includes any Jamaican citizen who is 18 years or over, lives in Jamaica, and is qualified and registered to vote. So you see three important qualifications are there that are highlighted in blue. Firstly, a person has to be over the age of 18 years to be able to vote. The person has to be qualified to vote, and also, very importantly, a person has to be registered to vote. So you don't just become 18 years old and turn up at a polling place, either to take part in an election or to take part in a referendum. There still, even though it's a right that you have, there still is a process that has to be followed by going to the Electoral Office of Jamaica and following their processes. Now, I'm going to now lastly look on some of the deeply entrenched provisions in our constitution, which would require the direct vote of the people. Now, firstly, Section 2 of the Constitution, which is known as the Supremacy Clause, is the clause or section which makes our Constitution the done of all dones. And what it says is that any law which is inconsistent with the Constitution will be void. And what this means is that if Parliament passes a law which contravenes or goes against or abridges or in any way conflicts with the Constitution, it is a nice Latin phrase, it is void ab initio. It is void as if it never existed. Now, Section 49 is also a deeply entrenched provision, and I indicated about it earlier. And this is the section which directs how you make changes to the very Constitution itself. Now, for our purposes, these next two sections are very important. Now, Section 34 establishes Parliament, and it includes as a part of Parliament the monarch, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Now, that section will by necessity have to be altered in order to remove the monarch. Yes, the monarch is a part of our Parliament now. So to remove the monarch as a part of the Parliament, that section will have to be amended. And then importantly, or perhaps more importantly, for this process, Section 68 is the section which indicates that the executive authority of Jamaica, of our country, is vested in the monarch. It is vested in the King of England, King Charles III, this handsome individual seen over here on the right, in his royal regala, or regala, tomato, tomato, potato, potato. So we want to hear from you. You can contact us in many different ways. We meet everyone where they are. So you can contact us via phone at 876-619-7846 and 876-618-5609. If you ask for me, they'll carry the phone to me as well. You can also find us on our websites. We have two. We have our ministry has its own website, which is www.mlca.gov.jm. MLCA meaning Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs. And then there is www.roadtorepublic.mlca.gov.jm. So that website no more specifically treats specifically with the whole constitutional reform process. And then we're on all of the socials. So all of these little social media stuff that you see, we're on all of them. You can find MLCA GovJM on Instagram, X, and Facebook. So X, formerly Twitter. You can find it on Facebook as well. And then Road to Republic JA, you can find us on Instagram, X, formerly known as Twitter, Facebook. You can actually also find us on TikTok. You can also send us an email, if there are any recommendations that you have for the Constitutional Reform Committee, or, if there's something that you wish to share with us, you can email us at constitutionalreform@mlca.gov.jm. So at this point in time, we're now open for, I think, next slide. Okay. I now turn over to
Thank you so much, Mr. Godfrey. And that is the end of the presentation. Now, this is where we will answer your questions. Now, I see a host of questions coming in the chat, and I would like to ask, so I see Dr. Spence's video is on. I'm going to ask all of our panelists to open their videos, but mute your microphones so we don't have an overlapping. So once I make mention of your name, you can just respond to the question being proposed. So I see a question here from Candice McCullough. Candice sent many questions, so I'll dissect them. So the first one, and I'll give this one to Dr. Spence, why have a prime minister and a president?
Oh, hello, Candice. Well, in a democracy, we usually talk about somebody who is the head of state and then somebody who is the head of government, or an office that represents the head of the state, and an office that represents the government. And the office of the head of state is not to be an office that is embroiled in the day-to-day issues related to government, which in our politics, government refers also to opposition. So we talked about a lot in the Constitutional Reform Committee. Who do we want to stand as the head of the nation? And then we talked about that person is somebody who represents national unity, or somebody who, when the nation is facing a particular kind of reality, who, when that office speaks, people knows that this office is not speaking from a particular political side. Most countries have a head of state and a head of government, democracies usually talk about democracies in respect of whether the head of state and the head of government are the same, as in an executive system, or whether there's a separation with the head of government and the head of state, as in a non-executive system. In this case, in Jamaica, what we are proposing is that we want a separation between the head of government, i.e. the prime minister, and the head of state, i.e. the president. So this is why we talk about a head of government and a head of state.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spence. Now, Candice also made mention in her list of questions. She said, why not leave it in the hands of the people of Jamaica to democratically choose a president for the country? So Candice is asking, why don't we have a president that the Jamaican people will elect? Dr. Spence?
Well, Candice, two things about Jamaica that perhaps if we were teaching civics, all of us would understand, is that in Jamaica, we don't practice direct democracy. We have an indirect form of democracy. In the US, for example, the US citizens do not vote for the president. They vote through an electoral college, and the electoral college then votes for the president. So we don't practice a direct democracy. So what we are proposing is that we continue along the principle of an indirect democracy, where our representatives vote for our leader, the head of state. We vote for the members of parliament, and then the members of parliament are expected to perform certain functions that would be agreed upon by the people in the constitution. That's the kind of democracy we currently practice. So this is not saying that we should never change from that kind of democracy, but we were continuing the idea, or working with the principle, that Jamaica practices an indirect democracy. You know, we don't gather in the town square every Monday morning and vote for the important decisions about how we run the country. We elect leaders who we believe are competent enough to make those decisions on our behalf. And every 5 years, depending on how those leaders do their job, we either vote them back in or we take them out of office. That's the kind of politics, a democratic system we currently have. Now, we can agree or disagree with whether or not we think that is adequate, it represents us well. We can agree or disagree about that, but Jamaica has had one of the stablest democracies since 1962. And you can look across the world and look at how democracies have fared and make a judgment about how our country has done. And so that is what we had and in the back of our minds when we thought about what kind of democratic system do we want to propose for our country.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Spence. Now, Mrs. Jana Miller-Williams, this question is for you. Now, Mr. Nicholas Foster posed a question in the chat earlier, and he said, in the event that the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition cannot reach a consensus, how would the president be chosen? Mrs. Miller-Williams, your audio is still muted.
Okay, thanks for that question. So if the leader of opposition and prime minister are unable to reach a consensus, then each should be empowered to make a separate nomination for confirmation by the parliament in a joint sitting of both the houses, where each house votes separately by secret ballot. But instead of an affirmative vote of 2/3, the successful nominee would in this case be confirmed on the vote of the absolute majority of each house. So that is how they would reach to some, well, not an agreement, but that is how the problem would be resolved.
Okay, thank you so much, Mrs. Miller-Williams. Now, Dr. Spence, somebody asked a question, and I think it's still Candice. Candice said, why are we talking about 7 years? 4 years seems like enough time.
No, well, one of the things we thought about, Candice, is how do we ensure that the life of the term of the president doesn't coincide with or is not negatively impacted by the life of parliament. Remember, life of parliament is 5 years. So we wanted a president whose term of office would represent a stabilizing force. So, and it would not coincide with the term of office of the prime minister or of the parliament. And we felt that 7 years would be a good time for the president to be in office so that the president could see the smooth transition of one particular government. And we felt that we didn't want it to extend to another 7 years, but we could, if necessary, we could extend that term to another 5 years, while at the same time we're seeking to find a replacement for that president. So I mean, we could say 3 years, 2 years, whatever. In our judgment, 7 years represents a good time for the president's office to do what a president's office is supposed to do, which is to lead the nation, present a kind of stabilizing, calming force for the people, and an office that even if electoral systems change, still represented the stability of our democracy.
Thank you, Dr. Spence. Now we have another question here. What are the timeframes for forming the Republic of Jamaica? What are the milestones and the order of priority of those milestones? I will give that question to Dr. Spence. Dr. Spence, you're on the Constitutional Reform Committee.
Okay, so one of the things when we started, remember, as Mr. Godfrey said, was that the Constitution lays out a time frame for its own reform. So when we started out, the Constitutional Reform Committee had a time frame which said, we would develop a report, submit the report to Parliament, have conversations on the report. A number of people had an issue with that particular time frame and felt that we first needed to go to the people, have conversations, get ideas, and come back. So we have been listening to people and listening to the responses in the public. And so one of the things that we have done subsequent to that is to say, okay, fine. So let us make sure that we are consulting, having consulted. We developed a report through deliberations, hearing from people presenting to the committee, from, of course, the report of the 1994, 1995 Joint Select Committee and the committee before we had started out by looking at those recommendations. And having done that now, the committee had submitted its report about a month and a half, 2 months ago to Parliament, sorry, to the Cabinet. And the Cabinet then, through the minister, submitted the report to Parliament as a ministry paper, and it's now in Parliament. Now, what happens after that is up to the government, because constitutional reform now becomes the government's part of the government's agenda, as any constitutional reform process will become part of the agenda that a government delivers. So we are not sure whether or not this would mean that the government is going to go ahead before the next general elections, whether it's going to remain until the next general elections, and whoever forms government then runs with it according to the timeline laid out in the Constitution. But as it is right now, the Constitutional Reform Committee has submitted its report to Parliament, to the cabinet. The cabinet submitted a ministry paper, tabled it as a ministry paper in Parliament. The cabinet will now inform us whether or not how they proceed. We don't know the timelines yet. That will have to come from the Parliament and the government of Jamaica.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spence. Now, a question that many persons will ask and have been asking since the Constitutional Reform Committee has been established is the first one: will our name change? Will we still be referred to as Jamaica? Will we be referred to as the Republic of Jamaica? Dr. Spence, that's a question for you. And then the next question is going to be from Mr. Godfrey. And this question is from Giovanni Wigan. And he says, will our Independence Day change? So Dr. Spence, first question is for you.
Okay, so that was an issue we discussed and voted on. Will it be the Republic of Jamaica or Jamaica? And I think we are all very comfortable with Jamaica. There are some countries who incorporate the Republic in their names. So Trinidad is referred to as the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. The United States is just the United States, even though it's a republic. Barbados is still Barbados. It didn't incorporate the republic in its name. So some countries incorporate the term the republic as a part of its name. Some countries don't. So Jamaica, so far the committee has recommended that the name of Jamaica will be Jamaica, even though Jamaica is will become a republic.
Thank you so much, Mr. Godfrey.
Yes, to answer Mr. Wigan's question. So no, our Independence Day will not change because it's etched in history. Our Independence Day will always be, hope I don't get it wrong, August 6, 1962. I don't know if perhaps when we've become a republic, if the government may decide that that too should become a national holiday, but it would still be a separate holiday from Independence Day.
Thank you so much, Mr. Godfrey. So we're going through the chat and we're trying to, get all of your questions answered. If you still don't think that your question has been answered, please ask your question so we can have our panelists make sure that they answer them as accurately and as effectively as they possibly can. So we have a question here from Janine, and this says, Janine Taylor, will there be fixed terms for both the Prime Minister and the President? Dr. Spence?
No, I mean, that was an issue and still is an issue that is being contemplated in the country. There are some people who feel that a democracy is best, one of the best practices of a democracy is fixed term election dates. There are some people who disagree with that. What we had recommended is that, well, our recommendations said two things. One, that both political parties should arrive at a consensus on this matter. There is now no consensus on this matter. But we then said, if they both agree, we recommend that the life of a parliament should extend, or the election date should be called within 3 months of the last day of the 5th year of the life of a parliament. So we know parliaments go in Jamaica for 5 years, so that it would be 3 months before elections could only be called 3 months before the last day of the end of parliament. That's what we have recommended as a part of our recommendations.
Another question that we have here is if there will be an independent committee who will make sure that the president is held accountable.
The recommendation spoke to, no, there will not be. I'm trying to remember the specific recommendation about the president. There are some specific deliverables that the president is expected to fulfill, and there are some specific conditions that if the president fails to fulfill these conditions, the president can be asked to leave office. So the Constitution lays out very clearly what the conditions are that would cause the president to a term of office to be terminated. And if the president does not, if the president of breaches these rules, then it would automatically mean an end to the term of office of the president.
Thank you, Dr. Spence. So we are seeing some questions here from our participants. We are going through a question from Miss Patricia Raymond says, will there be a retirement age for parliamentarians? I am not too sure if that is in the list of recommendations that we are proposing at this current time, Miss Raymond. Dr. Spence, I'm not sure if that was in the deliberations of the committee at this juncture.
No, that was not one of the deliberations. I'm not sure if this is one of those issues, and perhaps one of the legal education team can talk about if this is one of those issues that would be addressed if they need to be addressed in ordinary legislation, because I'm not sure how that would be addressed. I don't know if it would be a constitutional change, I'm not sure, or if these issues are addressed in ordinary legislation.
Or at the very least, at a different phase of the constitutional reform process.
Thank you, Dr. Spence. So I see a question here. Did the committee recommend term limits, 3 terms for Prime Minister and MPs? I'm Dr. Spence, I think we spoke about term limits for the president, correct?
Right. So we didn't recommend term limits for parliamentarians. We recommended term limits for the president.
Understood. Question from Candice, is there a maximum number of terms a person can sit in the seat or the office of the president and the prime minister?
Is there a maximum? No, remember, there are no term limits. So for the president, no, we didn't contemplate those things for those specifications for the members of parliament. There is a section, I'm not sure, as you say, at another phase of the electoral reform, of the constitutional reform process, that issue, I think, should be addressed, but not in this phase, because in this phase, we were looking at matters that were deeply entrenched and matters related to the head of state.
Okay, no problem. This question is now for Mrs. Miller-Williams. This is from Giovanni Wigan. They are asking, is there an age limit for someone to become a president or to become the president?
Okay, so with respect to this question, it would be 21, which would be the same number of years as an MP.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Now, Dr. Spence, I would ask the question that from the committee's perspective or from the deliberations and the insight from the committee, we know that there has been many hot button topic issues within the deliberations of the Constitutional Reform Committee. I just want you to touch on how it is that those deliberations were made, what the word consensus means, if it is that all the persons on the committee, had an input in making the forming the report of recommendations rather than the transition of the transition to the Republic of Jamaica rather.
Okay, thanks for that, Nastasia. So if you look at our terms of reference, which was one of those documents which was the document that we started out with as a committee, we talked about those issues that would be on the agenda for reform, and the terms of reference referred to the report circa in the mid-1990s as to the issues that are up for deliberation. That's one. Of those issues, we deliberate. Those were the issues that formed the agenda, in this first phase of the deliberations, and as we deliberated on each matter related to the Jamaicanization of the Constitution, related to the office of the president, related to the responsibilities of the president, related to the matters of citizenship, as we deliberate and others, as we deliberated on those matters, the decision that we took was that we would arrive at consensus. And the consensus didn't put you in a stranglehold and didn't say you couldn't change your mind, even if you had arrived at a consensus, because we revisited these issues time and time again. So the consensus meant that everyone in the room would agree on the issue, and if there was no agreement, it wouldn't be included in the report, or it would be included as a matter that was deliberated but upon which no consensus was arrived at, or a matter for which consensus was needed. So consensus in the context of constitutional reform must be understood in two ways. The committee decided on a process of consensus, but the Constitution also outlines what consensus should be. And for the Constitution, consensus is agreement between the political parties, the opposition and the government, the parties forming opposition and government. So even if we, as a committee, thought that we had consensus on a matter, meaning all the persons in the room agreed that this is the best strategy to take in this particular instance, we also had to think about the position of the two political parties on the matter, because the political parties had to agree on the issues before the issues, in the first phase at least, the ones that would be brought to the people would be brought to the people. So we deliberated on consensus in two respects. As I said, Nastasia, consensus within the committee, meaning that all of us would have to agree on a matter before we moved it forward, or consensus as well at the level of the Constitution, recognizing that for the Constitution, consensus is agreement between government and opposition.
Thank you, Dr. Spence. Now, this question is going to go to Mr. Ivan Godfrey. Now, I know a lot of persons may be here listening to our presentation on constitutional reform and trying to understand it as best as they can. Now, Mr. Godfrey, in the simplest terms, we're going to ask you just to break down the process of how it is that we can amend our constitution, because at the end of the day, that is what we're here to do. We're here to amend the constitution so that we can have a Jamaica that represents our identity or aspirations and cultural heritage, right? So break down the process of amending the constitution, the Jamaican constitution, for our participants online here.
I don't know, I felt like I did that already. But so, all right. First, we start with a bill, which is a proposed law, which has been drafted by the Office of the Parliamentary Council. It goes before Parliament. Now, if it's an entrenched provision, so it has some protection, but not as much protection as a deeply entrenched provision. It goes before Parliament. Before it is debated, it has to wait for 3 months have to elapse. And the thought process behind that is that, after the bill is there, you're supposed to be able to sensitize the public. Persons are supposed to be able to, know what the law is going to be and so on. Then after that 3 months, it goes through voting, it goes through the debating process. Then 3 months has to pass again before it is voted on by the House of Representatives. If it passes the House of Representatives at the requisite number, then it has to go before the Senate. The Constitution doesn't indicate a period of time that the Senate has to take to go through it and so on. Ultimately, if it's an entrenched provision and it is passed, then it will be assented to by the head of state. If it's a deeply entrenched provision, then it has to come to the electorate to vote, I believe, within 2 to 6 months after it has been passed. And then if the electorate votes in the referendum in favor of the measure, in favor of the amendment, that is when the head of state will then assent to it for it to become law. Just to indicate that under normal procedures, even though it is 2/3 majority in both houses of parliament for the amendment to be made to the entrenched or deeply entrenched provision, if it is something that is coming to the people for their vote, all that is required is a simple majority. So if 2 people go out and vote in the referendum and they vote in the affirmative, then the proposal would succeed. If 2 people go out and vote and they vote against it, then it's going to fail. So a part of our job here is to sensitize as many people as possible so that they can take part in the process, so that whatever we come out with in the end can be something that the majority of people can be happy with.
Thank you, Mr. Godfrey. Now, we have heard in the public, we have heard that persons are saying, if it is that the report of recommendations of the Constitutional Reform Committee, has been approved by Cabinet and it has been tabled in the Parliament of Jamaica, why is it now that, the Constitutional Reform Committee or even the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs is coming to the people now to ask for their feedback, because we want to hear from you. The recommendations, some may say that they're final and some may say that they're not. Now I'm going to pose this question to Mrs. Janelle Miller-Williams. Mrs. Miller-Williams, we want you to answer the question. Is the report final? Is it that the recommendations that have been tabled in Parliament, the recommendations that you have explained here this evening, is it that it is final and whatever questions being posed in the chat by our participants will, be null and void, or will there be an opportunity for those recommendations to change?
Okay, thank you for that question. Okay, so no, these recommendations are not final. They're just recommendations. So the public will have an opportunity to voice their opinions. The Constitutional Reform Committee is still live, and they do welcome feedback. So you have the opportunity of making submissions to the committee if you agree or disagree with a recommendation, or you have something else totally different in mind. So so the opportunity is there, and it will be there even further at a point where, perhaps we'll have a joint select committee where the public will also have an opportunity to voice their opinions. So no, these recommendations are not final, but it's just a phase, it's just a first step, or a step, I should say, to have like a frame in mind, and so persons can even start their discussions and their opinions. So it kind of opens a window for us to hear, or for the CRC, I should say, to hear your voices.
Awesome. I see Kavia says, will the concerns brought forward herein be contributed as recommendations of the participants or the views of the Jamaican people? And I think Mrs. Miller-Williams would have made mention to that question, would have answered that question. Sure.
All right, so I just asked to add something to that. Even before we reached where we have reached now, the Constitutional Reform Committee has had 5 town hall meetings across the length and breadth of Jamaica, certainly at least one in each county. In addition to that, they have heard representations from over 20 civil society and faith-based organizations which have made submissions either virtually or in person at the Constitutional Reform Committee meetings. In addition to that, the Public Engagement Subcommittee of the Constitutional Reform Committee, which Dr. Spence heads, has also been in the field meeting with persons in different spaces. Certainly from our division of 4 Men Strong, we have engaged in over 40 sensitizations across the island with over 2,000 people. Personally, I've been as far as Westmoreland to a high school to meet with 10th grade and 11th grade students. We've been to churches where we've been invited. We most recently went to St. Thomas. We have a sensitization to do tomorrow. Outside of that, we also have other further town halls, where we'll be continuing to go, where we've been on the road, we've been on the ground, and we'll continue to do so. And then even outside of that, as Mrs. Miller-Williams was indicating, if and when a bill is drafted and comes before Parliament, there will be a joint select committee where persons will be able to make recommendations. And then whatever whatever the bill is in the end has to be voted on by your members of parliament. So persons are certainly still able to reach out to their members of parliament to say, you know, I don't agree with this or I agree with this, and so on. So there really is, on the one hand, a multifaceted approach that we have taken to meet as many Jamaicans wherever they are. And there is also a multifaceted approach to how persons can take part in the process.
Thank you, Mr. Godfrey. So I'm very happy that Mr. Godfrey made mention of the town halls continuing. So they have not stopped. We have been doing different consultations and different sensitization sessions with different people in different spaces, as he mentioned, with schools, with churches, with public sector organizations, and we're looking to go into the private sector organizations as well. And important to mention that we will definitely have our town hall in this month, July 25th, that's Thursday, July 25th, at 7 p.m. at the Emancipation Park in St. Andrew. So for persons who are in Kingston and St. Andrew, they can come over to the town hall. But for persons who are not in Kingston or even St. Andrew or a neighboring parish, we will be live streaming on YouTube and there will be more details to come. Also, I would just like to, as we are about to wrap up, because I see that the questions are coming in. I see Miss Jeanette Calder said, I have posed a question on impeachment that may have been missed, soliciting a response, please. Much thanks. Miss Calder, if you could just repeat your question, because I'm sure it would have been lost in the chat, and we will ask Dr. Spence to answer that question. But, or sensitization sessions and or community sessions with persons within different parishes, different communities, different areas has not stopped. The sensitization and the journey to the Republic continues. Now, while Miss Calder, let's just see if it is that she posed her question again. No. Okay. I'll ask somebody to just read the question.
Parliamentarians are possibly the only employees where one would have to commit a crime to be dismissed. The PM promised to change this to make performance and moral conduct a basis for removal from the House. Why did the CRC decide against impeachment or recall provisions, even though there is bipartisan support and the minister committed to it in the first phase? In the first phase last November in the House, the minister. Okay, well, if the minister committed to impeachment in the House, I'm not sure if that necessarily means that the CRC would have agreed. One of the things we did on this matter of impeachment and recall is that we did extensive research, and I would suggest that we all look at the matter of impeachment and recall and do your own research, Jeanette, on how impeachments have proceeded in democracies, whether in parliamentary democracies and presidential democracies. I am of the view, having done my own research, that we have already mechanisms in place to deal with high crimes and treason or any other significantly important malfeasance that rises to the level of breaking the law. We already have those provisions in place in our democracy, in our country, so that if a MP or a member of, or a senator or anybody breaks the law, then we have clear laws that says if you have broken this particular law, this is how you should be dealt with. And we also see in the place that uses impeachment a lot, which is the United States, that impeachment does not result in the change or in a public official being removed from office. So, I mean, we can have the conversation, Jeanette, as to whether or not impeachments work. Do we have systems in place that could do the work that we require of a process that we think should be an impeachment process? And even if even if it had been recommended by the minister or the prime minister, the work of the committee was to look at how an impeachment process would work and to look at examples across the world. And having looked at examples in a non-partisan way, looking at how it would sit and rest within our democracy, we recommended that impeachment wouldn't be wouldn't be a recommend. Well, it wouldn't be a recommendation that we recommend for the reform process. I think Jeanette, if you do some research on impeachments in parliamentary democracies and see if you still think that impeachment or recall is the best solution to the matter of holding public officials accountable.
And I'd just like to add some practical examples to the back end of that response. So, for example, the last 3 times that the United States has had impeachment processes instituted, the last 2 times, well, firstly, in the United States, first the person has to be impeached by the Congress, and then the person has to be convicted by the Senate. Now, the last United States president was impeached on 2 occasions. However, when it reached to the Senate, they did not have sufficient votes to convict him. And so nothing essentially came from the impeachment process. The time before that was Bill Clinton in the 90s. And once again, it was the same situation. He was impeached by the House. However, there weren't sufficient votes to impeach him to convict him in the Senate. And so nothing ended up coming from the process. Now, outside of the presidential impeachment, most recently, the Secretary of Homeland Security was impeached by, and this goes to another point. Let me just explain the point before giving the example. Now, the notion is sometimes impeachment turns out becoming a partisan process. So whichever party or organization is in power in that particular country would use the power of impeachment against the other side that is not in power in circumstances where there may not be an impeachable offense, or in circumstances where impeachment really isn't made out, but because they have majority numbers, they can push it through. Now, the most recent example of that was in the United States of America again, where the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, was impeached by the Congress in circumstances where the Democratic side of Congress was saying that there was no high crime or misdemeanor committed, which is the basis for impeachment in their country. So in their mind, it was a purely partisan activity that was led to his impeachment. And then once again, there was not enough votes in the Senate for him to be convicted. So nothing essentially came of it. So what the argument of the Constitutional Reform Committee is that if a person has committed a crime, the arm of government that is to deal with that is the court system. And we have had in Jamaican history circumstances where parliamentarians have been convicted by the courts. So that's perhaps the rationale for the view of the constitutional reform.
Thank you so much, Mr. Godfrey. I see here where Mr. Wigan is saying he had posed a question earlier to say, what are the current plans regarding the changing of the age of consent, or alternatively maintaining the current age but granting permission for activities such as work, obtaining an NIS card, and acquiring a national ID? Mrs. Miller-Williams and or Dr. Spence, can we have a response to that question? The question from Mr. Giovanni Wigan, it says, what are the current plans regarding changing the age of consent, or alternatively maintaining the current age but granting permission for activities such as work, obtaining an NIS card, and acquiring a national identification?
Well, I know some of it because of my own work in the women's sector and the Sexual Offences Act and matters related to that. I know that that is where some of that is addressed, and matters related to the Sexual Offences Act. So we talk a lot about ordinary legislation and whether or not all of the issues that we have should be addressed in the level of the Constitution, or whether or not we have the kinds of reform at the level of ordinary legislation to address some of those issues. So I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yes, I just add to that to say, just as Dr. Spence has indicated, the age of consent is already dealt with in ordinary legislation. It's not something that the Constitutional Reform Committee would have to treat with. in the whole constitutional reform process. So that is dealt with under the Sexual Offences Act and so on. And then in respect of the ability of children to work, the Child Care and Protection Act does deal with that in different phases, really. So it says that at I believe 13 years old, a child can participate in certain amount or level of work insofar as it doesn't affect their ability to learn and so on. And then at the age of 15, there's a certain other level of work and certain other amount of work that they can participate in. So there is presently legislative dispensation that deals with those issues. As to whether it may need to change, that might be something to consider, but certainly this is not the process that would do so.
Thank you. Keishawn is asking, why is there no multiple town hall meetings in Kingston for citizens' query? Now, as I mentioned before, Keishawn, we would have had 5 town hall meetings already in 3 different counties, and we are still ongoing with the town halls. I made mention earlier that we will have a town hall in this month, July 25th at 7 p.m. at the Emancipation Park in Kingston. So you will be able to come to the town hall and hear your questions and get your responses. And we are planning other town halls and other sensitization sessions because, we don't want to just use the approach or the method of just town halls. We want to meet everybody where they are. Not many persons can come to a town hall based on where they are located, and not many persons can have the access rather to join, whether it's Zoom here or Facebook Live or even YouTube Live, to get the questions or hear the recommendations of the Constitutional Reform Committee. So we are meeting them in their spaces, meeting them where they're at, so that they can also have the benefit of understanding and learning, a simplified version of what our Constitution says and what are the amendments that we are proposing to make. Now we are winding down. We have just a few more minutes left on this webinar, and we are just scrolling through to see some of the questions. We spoke about impeachment. Dr. Spence spoke about impeachment. I see a question from Mr. Francis. I know the committee steered clear of term limits, but was any consideration given to recalling MPs before their term is complete? I'm not sure if Dr. Spence can speak on that topic. Not sure.
We didn't steer clear of anything. That's not true. In fact, the report and Ms. Calder is still questioning, or what she says is our lack of consideration of impeachment. If you go to the report does mention impeachment. And even though we discussed recall briefly, I'm not remembering now what exactly the discussion was about, but I think one of the things I would say to those who are listening and who would like to make recommendations is that we had highlighted already what the avenues were for you to make your recommendations. So please make those recommendations, and remember, these are recommendations. And so there are several steps to go before we get to making this a final document which we then vote on. And even then, the people of Jamaica would have to vote on it. So I think we should remember what the process says and how the process should be executed, and that we had already stated in this that these are the recommendations. So I don't think we need to quarrel at this point. I think what we need to do is submit our recommendations. I think one of the things that certainly Ms. McFarlane, we had planned to do from the Public Engagement Committee is to discuss those issues which are more contentious, like impeachment, the Caribbean, the final court, the matter of the president and matters related to the president, that we want to pull those out of the recommendations and then have public conversations on them through social media. I noticed as well, Ms. McFarlane, that a lot of people are saying, why aren't we having this on Facebook and on YouTube? I mean, that is something that can be, we don't have to come up with a conspiracy theory as to why that hasn't happened. It can happen. If people say, okay, we would like to have this on YouTube or through Facebook, then we will arrange that. We will arrange that as well, so that more people can join in and more people can share their ideas and opinion. But we're encouraging people to send, the screen is up where you can send your suggestions, send your ideas, and we can have the discussions about the particular areas of the recommendations that you agree with or not agree with. So it's not a final document. We are still going through the process, and we welcome your feedback.
Most definitely, Dr. Spence, and I think that was well said. And for Miss Kavia, as Dr. Spence mentioned, the screen is up with our contact information, the numbers for the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs. We also have the website up. So just a correction to what's on the slide. There is no www dot on the website. It's just mlca.gov.jm. Or for the Road to Republic or the Constitutional Reform website, it is just roadtorepublic.mlca.gov.jm. So just clarity, there's no www dot at the beginning of the websites. So you can go on the websites, you can read the minutes of the Constitutional Reform Committee. I saw somebody mention in the chat if a specific conversation was in the minutes, and I'm sure if it is that Dr. Spence is making mention of it, that the Constitutional Reform Committee deliberated about it, it is documented in the minutes. You can see all of the minutes from all the meetings that the committee would have had thus far. And you can also follow the ministry on social media, the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, X, formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram, and also the Road to Republic pages. Road to Republic JA. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, X, formerly known as Twitter, and also on TikTok, right? And you can send your questions. I saw Keishan asking where can they send their recommendations. This is where you can send it at the email, the very last text at the bottom. It is constitutional reform at mlca.gov.jm. It's the last thing, the last text at the bottom, constitutional reform at mlca.gov.jm. Please send us your recommendations. If you have a concern about a specific recommendation that you've heard here highlighted tonight, or that you have read and you need a little bit more understanding, please send us those questions, those concerns, or even if you have suggestions for what should be within this process for us to amend our constitution so that we can achieve the goal of becoming a republic, for Jamaica to become a republic. Now, I am not seeing. I'm saying, will the recommendation be added? Yes, Keshan, the recommendation will be sent to the Constitutional Reform Committee. They will deliberate and they will see how best it is that it can be, included into the amendments, or if it has already been included into the amendments, but just in a different way or fashioned in a different perspective than what you were thinking. I want to say that is it. I will give each panelist 2 minutes, their final words, just to wrap up in terms of what it is we are looking forward to from the ministry side of sensitization, of reaching out more to the public, of getting all of our Jamaicans to understand this legal process. And that's from Mr. Godfrey and also Mrs. Miller-Williams. And then the final word from Dr. Nadeen Spence from the Constitutional Reform Committee on why it is important for us to be a part of this process. Mr. Godfrey?
All right, young age before beauty. So I'd like to thank everyone who has signed on to be with us here today. Thank you for your questions. They've been very thought-provoking. But if there is anything that I want everyone to take away from this process, is that the process is not finished. It's our process. We all have to own it and be a part of it. And I can tell you that certainly from the stance of the Legal Education Division, we are willing and able to come anywhere that you're willing to have us. So if it's at your church, if it's at your civil society organization, Rotary, Kiwanis, if it's at your SDC or the police officers youth club, wherever it is, anywhere on the island of Jamaica, we are willing to come once you can put live bodies in a room that we can express the information to, give the information to, and then we can take your feedback, and ensure that the Constitutional Reform Committee hears what everyone across the length and breadth of Jamaica has to say on this process. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you, Mr. Godfrey. Mrs. Miller-Williams?
Yes, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who took the time to come and, to educate yourself on this process. As we had indicated before, it is in the early stages, right? So this is why we want to engage you and for you to know how such an important process it is. It affects us all. The Constitution, remember, being the supreme law of the land, so it affects us all. And as such, we want to, as best, go out, as Mr. Godfrey said, go out to all areas, all parishes, to educate and to have further discussions, right? So, like I said, the Constitution affects us all, and as such, it is integral that we get your feedback, your opinions, your any feedback that you have on today's session, as well as the CRC report, as well as your own research, is very critical to the process. And as such, it is an open process, and it's just the beginning. It's nowhere to the end as yet.
Thank you, Dr. Spence. Thank you, Mrs. Miller Williams. My apologies, Dr. Spence. Your 2 minutes.
Yeah, so we want to ensure that we are connecting with Jamaicans from all walks of life. One of the things I like to say to people is if you can get 6 people on your veranda, then we can have some veranda talk. I mean, we might do it by Zoom or do it by, but we can talk. We have the technology available nowadays to ensure that every Jamaican who wants to connect to the process, who wants to understand what the process is about, who want to understand the recommendations, who want to have their say on the recommendations, we have the technology to do that. We might not be in the best place right now following on Hurricane Beryl, because I know some people know, perhaps are not able to join because they don't have electricity, they don't have access to the technology to allow them to join. But this is not a process that is going to end. No, we have another live on Wednesday. So you can, talk to others about joining and about asking questions. And remember, we're not here to agree or disagree. We are here to put forward our suggestions. You are here to put forward your suggestions, and we're here to answer the questions that you ask and to tell you what the committee has recommended. And I will explain as much as possible what the process was. So join us again on Wednesday and look out for us in a space or a community near you. And as I say, if you can put your youth fellowship together, your men's fellowship at church, your women's fellowship, the stewards board, and invite us. We'll come, or if you just want us to come one morning and talk to you at church, we will do that as well. So just make sure that you are listening, that you tell people about this opportunity to participate. Some people have suggested Miss McFarlane, YouTube, Facebook, and others. And of course, I know that you know that these are things that we're thinking about and that they will come in very short order. Because thank you all for joining.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Spence. And again, I can't express, our gratitude here enough. We thank all the participants for joining. And as Dr. Spence mentioned, we are having another session on Wednesday, same time, same place at 6 p.m. at this link. So for persons who were not able to be a part of this session today, please ask them to register. Send them the link. Each one, tell a friend, tell another friend, tell another friend, and we will definitely come on Wednesday again, giving information. And for all the questions that have been posed in the chat, these are considerations that I'm sure the Legal Education Division and Dr. Spence will bring back to the Constitutional Reform Committee so that, these materials may be shared and help for persons to understand a little bit more about how the deliberations were made. And then also I was seeing certain policies that Ms. Calder was asking for us to share or even research on the impeachment issue. So these are good things that we're going to take as feedback so we can go and see how best we can delve a little bit deeper so that persons can understand a little bit more. But we will be here again on this same platform on Wednesday, that's July 10th at 6 p.m. For persons who do not know where they can access the report is on our websites. And as I made mention before, the websites are MLCA, that's for the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs, so mlca.gov.jm or roadtorepublic.org. www.mlca.gov.jm. You can go on either of those websites and you can look through the tabs. You will see where it says full CRC report, and you can read the recommendations for yourself. You know, we have broken down recommendations in simple language here for you this evening, but if you want to hear it straight from what the CRC would have said, please go ahead and read the report. And if you do have more questions on the recommendations, having read the report after tonight and you want to come back on Wednesday, please feel free to come. And as I said, tell somebody to come so that they can understand. The Republic is about us, and the Republic starts with us. And if it is that we're not a part of the process, then we won't become the Republic, right? So we have to make sure that everybody is interested, everybody's engaged, and that we can get to this road, get to this destination of becoming the Republic of Jamaica. For everyone, thank you so much for joining us. And this is the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs, the inaugural Road to Republic webinar. Signing out. Thank you so much, and do enjoy the rest of your evening.